Hello there, darlings. Last year, in November, December 2023, I gave a three-part interview with Jeff Bomo on his YouTube channel PTS for Life, where for the very first time I talked about my upbringing in Scientology, having signed the billionaire contract to join the Sea Org when I was 9 years old, then joining the Sea Org, which is the elite organization within Scientology, when I was then 13 years old, having worked there and then having left with 20, and then slowly but surely waking up to the realization that Scientology is all pretty much a scam, lies, and it's incredibly harmful. And that was the very first time that I spoke publicly about it. I have spoken with my friends, talked about individual stories that happened, incidences, and so on and so forth, but I'd never told my story quite so complete in a chronological order as I did with Jeff. And this was November, December 2023. Then in March, I believe it was March the 6th or the 7th, my sister and her husband, my brother-in-law, they disconnected from me. Disconnection in Scientology means that they have to, they have to cut off any communication with me. The reason being because I dared to speak out about Scientology. Now, I was simply talking about my own story, what had happened to me. And when I asked them, well, did you actually watch the interview? Can you tell me what it was that I said that was wrong or wasn't quite accurate or whatever? They told me quite confidently, no, we never watched it, but we just simply know that you said something negative about Scientology. And so they were told that they have to disconnect from me. And then I knew that eventually the rest of my family will disconnect from me. And so when my sister, my brother-in-law, they disconnected to me, I said, well, at this point, I might as well just do a YouTube channel. And that's when I started my YouTube channel. I think a day or 2 days later, on the 8th of March, I started my YouTube channel here, starting to post videos and talking about my own story, explaining Scientology, doing interviews with other ex-Scientologists or the so-called never-ins, so people who have never been in Scientology but are very much interested in part of the movement of exposing Scientology, the abuses in Scientology, and so on and so forth. And so I started doing that, and from that moment onward, I knew that eventually my brother and my stepfather, they will have to disconnect from me. But it didn't happen yet, so I just thought, just keep going, keep going. Since March and August 2024, I've been speaking to my brother every once in a while about Scientology, why I am talking about Scientology, what are the bad things about Scientology. I told him different things that didn't make sense within Scientology, and very often he nodded and he could agree to a certain degree what I was telling him, which is quite incredible if you think about the fact that he is very much still a Scientologist, but he has lived long enough, shall we say, not directly in contact with Scientology, because you see, as a Scientologist, you're supposed to be on course, on study, 2.5 hours a day, 12.5 hours a week, basically. So either every day 2.5 hours or on the weekend, so that you have your 12.5 hours a week. And he, as I understand, had not been going to the Scientology organization quite so regularly, so he's had more time to sort of be in the regular world and interact and talk to normal people, shall we say. And I think that way he was able to realize that Scientology isn't all good and all wonderful. He was able to recognize there are certain things in Scientology that are not right and have not been done correctly. And so I always had these conversations with him in the hopes of dropping some seeds and hope that some of them will take root, so that when the time comes where he will be told you have to disconnect now, that he will say, no, I'm not going to do that. I was really hoping that would happen, but and at one point he actually said that even to me, that he's going to keep going with Scientology as much as he can, and if he's not able to continue with Scientology, maybe there's a certain important step that he cannot do if he's connected with a so-called suppressive person. I would be considered a suppressive person because I dare to speak out about Scientology, that he then will tell them, no, I'm not going to disconnect from my brother. And so I was quite confident that wasn't going to happen. But unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago on Saturday, my brother, well, actually, it was a week before that particular Saturday, he called me up and we had about 3 hours at conversation on the phone. And he basically told me that he's been told he has to disconnect from me and he is going to do that. And I told him, obviously that I'm very saddened by that, but that if he's going to do this, really, then he needs to talk to our stepmother about that, because our stepmother was never involved in Scientology. And she wouldn't understand this sort of thing. She wouldn't understand why we cannot spend Christmas together anymore. Why she goes to him to have Christmas and then have to go to me to have Christmas rather than all of us together having Christmas, for example. She wouldn't understand that. It wouldn't make sense to her. And I told him, if you're going to do this, you need to tell her. You need to tell her. You can't just ignore it and not say anything. And to his credit, he did that. He had the balls to actually come to her house. I was there as well, and he was explaining the whole situation to her. She obviously had difficulty understanding it, but in the end, she understood the situation. And she's not happy with it, of course, but she understands that he is forced to do this. He doesn't have a choice in that way. And what I mean by that is because Scientology is blackmailing him, basically. Scientology is saying, if you want to have your spiritual freedom, the only way to become free, to become spiritually more aware, more advanced, and then you cannot talk to your brother Samuel anymore. And I call this blackmail because my brother genuinely believes that is true, that his immortality in that sense is sort of dependent on that. Of course, he believes he's a spiritual being, that he is immortal, is going to be born again and again, but he's in Scientology, you're trying to break out of this cycle, to be reborn again and again and again. Every time when you start a new life, you forget everything, and then you have to start from zero. You have to start all over again. And in Scientology, the idea would be to be able to break that cycle consciously, and to not lose all your memories and all of that. And then, of course, regain the supernatural powers that you are born with. Well, born. Hubbard never talks about how a Thetan was born or created. He's never talked about the creation story, really, of a Thetan. At least I've never heard or seen anything like that. But what we do know from his writing is that each individual person is an immortal spiritual being called a Thetan, who is incredibly powerful. But because he was bored, the Thetan was bored with all the power. I mean, I was able to create a universe by just snipping my fingers, basically. And because I was so powerful, I was bored, and so I put in blockages so I cannot use these powers. But over the millennia, I forgot about it, and I completely forgot that I even had these powers. And that's where Scientology comes in, where they are supposed to help you to unlock these abilities again, so you don't go back into the cycle of being reborn and all of that. And so they are basically dangling this in front of him and saying, well, if you're still talking to Samuel, you're not able to reach that. And so that's why I'm saying they're forcing him. He doesn't have a choice because he genuinely believes this. He genuinely believes that that is the only way to gain spiritual freedom. Now, I personally think that rather than that he really believes in Scientology, at this point it is that he hopes in Scientology. He hopes it's actually true. He hopes it works. And, I told him, all right, if you're going to do this, insist always on the end phenomena. The end phenomena is when you do a course, and on the course pack, it usually says what is the goal of the course, right? The goal is that, whatever it is, it will tell you the ability that you're supposed to have gained by having done this course. And I told him that if you're going to do this, make sure you insist on this ability. Do not sell yourself short. Do not be do not say, yeah, that's okay. I haven't quite reached that, but I think I'm doing quite well enough that we can say, all right, now this course is done or whatever. Insist on actually achieving that particular goal. Because I pointed out to him that there is a state in Scientology called a clear. And Hubbard gives a very precise description as well in some areas it's a bit broad, but in certain things it's very precise on what a clear is supposed to be able to do. And I told him that per Hubbard himself, the founder of Scientology, I personally have never met a clear. Never. And yet there's so many people who have attested to the state of clear. And so if he's going to get to that point, and of course beforehand, he needs to insist on actually getting these things before he actually attests, because otherwise he would have paid for something that he didn't actually get. And he did tell me that he would do that, and so on and so forth. So yeah, 2 weeks ago, that was the last time I saw him. And incidentally, so this was on August the 3rd, Saturday. And on August the 1st, this newspaper put out an article with me in it. In this article, it basically tells my story in having grown up in Scientology. And I actually took a copy of this with me. It's this one. I have done a video about this particular, so do check it out. And I had a copy of this, and I gave it to him. I opened it to the page where my story is at, and I told him, look, I've also published now, together with Andrea Heffley, she is the reporter who put it all together, but she's the one who interviewed me. We put this out there. Please read through it and tell me if anything in there that is wrong. And if there's nothing wrong with it, and yet it is still negative, then don't you think the story itself is a negative thing? And the whole story is about me growing up and struggling within Scientology. And he looked me dead in the eye and told me, no, he's not going to read it because he's not allowed to read it. That was quite a weird moment for me, having been out of Scientology for so long, that he is stopping himself from reading that. I mean, he could have read it right there. Nobody would have known other than me, my stepmother, and him, right? He could have read it there and, fair enough. But he said, no, I'm not going to read it. But he still took it with him. So I hope he will read it at some point. I don't know. Or maybe he will give it up to Osa. I don't know. But anyway, that's what happened. So now my brother has disconnected from me. And so the last person really that would be disconnecting from me would be my stepfather. Now, he wasn't there at this conversation. My stepfather, he knew this conversation was happening. And unfortunately, he decided not to be there, to be witness of the situation, which I can understand. I mean, he is the stepfather, but he raised us. He's been there pretty much from the beginning. And so I understand that maybe just from the standpoint of a father, he just doesn't want to see this happening. His two sons, this connection happening, and so on and so forth. But after this discussion that I had with my brother and my stepmother, I actually texted my stepfather to say, look, as you know, we had this conversation, what is your view on this? What, is there anything you'd like to say or anything like that? And from what I can tell, he blocked my number because the message it was sent, but it didn't, he didn't receive it. And so I'm pretty sure he blocked my number now. So I will have to assume that also my stepfather is now disconnected from me. So basically the family with whom I grew up has disconnected completely from me. So my sister, my brother, my stepfather, and of course my mother, although I have not had any official disconnection from her, but considering that she's working in the Sea Org, the elite organization within Scientology, it would be very unlikely to believe that she wouldn't be disconnected from me. So, yeah. And, that was to be expected. I knew this was going to happen. The moment that I did the interview with Jeff back in November, December 2023, I knew this was going to happen eventually. But I had thought about talking about my story for years beforehand, for a couple of years, a few years, more than just 2 years. And for a long time I didn't, because I didn't want this to happen, this disconnection. And, in 2023, I just said, I have to talk about it because I know about it. There's not so much happening in Europe about it, and now much more. There are many more channels as well. And I just felt like I had to talk about it. I have to do this. And yeah, and I do not regret it, because all I do is I tell my story. All I do is I talk and explain about Scientology. And if my family decides to disconnect from me, that is their decision. You know, I mean, I'm not saying that my brother is completely innocent in that way, because he is an adult. And if he makes this decision to disconnect from me, you know, that is also his responsibility. But I told him that I loved him, that if ever he needed any help, he can always reach out to me, that there is no hard feeling. I completely understand why he's doing it, because I was in that mindset as well. So I do understand that. And that however long it will take, I will be here. There will be no, you know, I have no ill feelings towards him for what he's doing, because, again, I understand it. He grew up in Scientology as I did. He doesn't know any better in that way, in that sense, you know. The same thing with my sister. I also sent her an email saying, look, I understand, and my door is always open. If ever you need anything, you need any help, you just reach out to me. And that goes the same to my stepfather. I mean, if he is watching, will be watching this at some point or whatever. And even to my mother in England, who's still working in England at St. Hill, in the Siok. If she decided that she's had enough and she's leaving and she needed help, I would help her. And yeah, so that is my latest update on the disconnection in my family. And yeah, that is basically what has happened. I want to thank you for having watched this, for having been part of my journey in this, in talking about Scientology, exposing the abuse in Scientology, and of course the consequences of the disconnection and whatever else might happen in the future. I appreciate you being here, having subscribed, liking this video, and with that, I do hope you have a very nice day. Goodbye.